webinar. One, some of you have heard me already request if you could please add your names to the chat, as well as where you are participating from. And if you have any colleagues joining you for the webinar, please list that as well. The next is, if you have any difficulty with the audio during the course of this chat, you can list, during the course of the webinar, you can list in the chat a phone number at which we can contact you on. I know in the past some participants have had a challenge, and it seems that if we're able to call you, it works quite well to do the audio that way. So please just notify us in the chat, and then we will take the next steps to join you that way. The next thing is to let you know a little bit about the organization for the webinar today. As I mentioned, my colleague Nelson Gamonda is participating, and he will give some opening remarks, which will be followed by Sutali presenting the details of the updated mutual accountability mechanism. And then we should have plenty of time for a very open discussion of questions from participants. And we even have, if we have time, we have some guided discussion which we can go into as well. So we typically have an hour planned for the webinars, but do have an extra half hour at the end. If we would like to continue our conversation, we most certainly can do so. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Nelson to kick off our conversation. Nelson, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Marisa, and many thanks for the great introduction, and welcome to those who are joining today. I would rather maybe begin by saying good morning or good afternoon to all of us. And my job at the beginning of this webinar is very simple, as Marisa asked it, to kind of like give an introductory maybe remarks in terms of why is SWA now focusing on the mutual accountability mechanism. So I have some few slides just to take you through the background to this, and then my colleague Sitali, as Marisa said, he will give more details about the mutual accountability mechanism. So let's kick off with the next slide, please. Great. I didn't realize that maybe I can also take over as a presenter. So for us in the SWA partnership as we know it, even from its foundation at the beginning, accountability has been one of the key issues of emphasis. I think this is something that most of us know why the partnership exists. Of course, we know the SWA as a global partnership of country governments, private sector, civil society, external support agencies, research and learning institutions, and other partners. We work together to catalyze political leadership and action, but more importantly also to improve accountability and, of course, on the use of scarce resources. Now we can say that in the SDG era, accountability is a key aspect of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and of course for success on the water, sanitation and hygiene targets. And if we are needed to make progress in the water, sanitation and hygiene, then definitely it will depend on how much all stakeholders will hold each other accountable for the progress that we are making at various levels. Now, coming to SWA, maybe the question is, why is SWA promoting mutual accountability? What we need to understand, and maybe we can also be recording as we make this presentation, is that for us, accountability is quite critical, and it's reflected in our guiding principles as a partnership, but also it's mentioned quite well within our collaborative behaviors. And most of us on the call are familiar with the SWA collaborative behaviors that the partners have agreed. And accountability really entails collective and multi-stakeholder action. So that's one key issue that we know is important, and also it involves global sharing of priorities and ideas across different partners and also across different levels. And as I mentioned, especially in the new era of the SDGs, it is quite critical for us to report on the progress against the SDG targets. Now, if you recall, we have 4 collaborative behaviors, which talks about enhancing government leadership of sector planning processes. It talks about strengthening and using country systems. But the third behavior talks about using one information and mutual accountability platform. So this is where we specifically highlight the need for accountability. And of course, the fourth collaborative behavior talks about building sustainable water and sanitation sector financing. So this is where we see that accountability is quite critical, and within the work of SWA, it has been one of the key issues. Now, if we talk about the background a little bit more, you know, as the partnership, we have a number of guiding principles. We have a set of guiding principles, and one would say that these are the values that all the partners within the SWA have in common, and they guide our joint action. So we have about 7 of these, and if I may just go through them, if you see at the top of these particular slides in blue, our guiding principles talks about a multi-stakeholder efforts. So all partners work to ensure that we have in common values and we value multi-stakeholder efforts. It talks about sustainability of services and actions. It also talks about leaving no one behind. And then when you talk of accountability, it's mentioned in the 4th bullet that you can see here. It talks about transparency and
Marisa, it looks like we've lost Nelson. I think his line has dropped.
Okay.
Yes. So I'm back. I'm so sorry about that. So I don't know what happened. It looks like technology doesn't like me at this hour. I don't know why. I'll have to check those responsible for technology in my area what happens. So I was just sharing with you and going through the guiding principles that SWA partners have in common, and also that guide our joint action. So I was sharing or mentioning that we have transparency and accountability mentioned in the 4th guiding principle, as you can see in the blue. And then the other one talks about evidence-based decision making. It talks about human rights to water and sanitation, as well as international collaboration and aid effectiveness. Now, beyond the guiding principles, the SWA partners have agreed the collaborative behaviors, which I shared earlier on. But the collaborative behavior are like the how partners work together to put in place the building blocks. And when we talk about the building blocks, they are like the what. What do partners jointly put in place to achieve an effective sector? So if we are to have an effective sector, and if we really are to make progress to achieve the SDGs, we talk about making sure that we have these 5 building blocks They talk about sector policies and strategies being in place as critical if we are needed to move and make progress on the sanitation and water targets. Then there is institutional arrangements, sector financing, and then we also have planning, monitoring, and also review. And at that particular time, when we are talking about planning, monitoring, and review, it also is important to ensure that we take into account issues of accountability at that particular moment. And then we also have capacity development. So all these three, we can say they kind of like form the pillars of the accountability mechanism. All these three, the guiding principles, the collaborating behaviors, the building blocks, they all have a part to play, especially in the accountability mechanisms. And for us, within the SWA, we have come up with accountability mechanism, which is like a joint initiative that now grounds the work that we do in a specific, measurable, attainable, and relevant as well as timely action. So this is quite, I think, important for us. And then it also reinforces the multi-stakeholder decision-making and mutual accountability among partners at the national, regional, as well as the global levels as well. Now, with this background, some of us will recall, those of us who have been long on the road of SWA or who have been partners for SWA for some time, you recall that in the past, SWA used to have commitments. And then maybe the question is, how is the current mutual accountability mechanism different from the previous set of commitment processes? So maybe there are 4 points that I can mention here, which are important for us to remember, and also to distinguish what we have from the previous commitments processes. And of course, these are commitment processes that used to be tabled during high-level meetings between 2010 and 2016. So the first point that we would say about the previous processes is that they were designed basically for the high-level meetings, for the SWA high-level meetings. And then secondly, commitments were created basically as maybe a SWA or SWA process. So there was no proper grounding within the processes of planning at the national level. And then thirdly, only country partners and donors made commitments at that period of time, but mostly we had commitments being made by country partners. And the fourth point is important. Most of these commitments were not always embedded in broader national processes. So you'd have maybe some few partners come together as part of the preparations for the high-level meetings. Then they generated a set of commitments, and they were never linked to the existing planning or review processes at the country level. So that's what was happening in the previous commitment processes. Now, in the current, the new updated mutual accountability process, there are also 4 points that we can say here, which are like maybe the changes that have been made. So if we're asking what is the updated mutual accountability mechanism, then definitely it is different from the previous one in the sense that in the current one, all SWA partners, unlike previously, will make commitments. So it's not going to be just country partners or external support agencies or like donors making commitments, but now we are expecting all SWA partners to make commitments. And of course, at the time that they are making commitments, it has to be also maybe through national planning and review cycles, and making sure that these are linked to the existing national planning and review cycles, and that will be forming the basis for creating commitments. So it's not necessarily supposed to be a parallel process just specifically for SWA or as part of preparations for the high-level meetings, but it has to be something that is based on the national planning and review cycles at the country level. And then the third point here also talks about the process being multi-stakeholder. So we believe that a multi-stakeholder process is essential, a process that brings all the stakeholders, the civil society, the external support agencies, the private sector, the research and learning institutions, as well as, of course, under the leadership of the governments themselves. Then the commitments that are tabled, whether at the regional level, at the global level, would have to be drawn from the national targets and milestones. So here there is an effort to make sure that in the current set of the mutual accountability processes, commitments are drawn from existing national targets and milestones. So in this particular case, it means that a country, after they have gone through this multi-stakeholder process, they can pull out maybe 3 or so commitments that are quite critical, outlining the targets and milestones that have been identified at the country level, and these can be shared during the high-level meetings. This could be the sector ministers' meetings or the finance ministers' meetings. I think that's what is coming out in the updated MAT accountability mechanism. But then my colleague Sitali on the call today, he will give us more details on the mutual accountability mechanism. I was just trying to give you a bit of a background in terms of where we're coming from, what is different from the previous set of processes that we had, and what is now new in the current set or in the current process of the mutual accountability mechanism. I think I can stop here and give the mic back to you, Marisa. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nelson. I'll just take a quick moment, because I believe we've had some new participants join us, just to quickly remind people that if you would please add your name to the chat, and if there's anyone else joining you, that would be great. But also to say, if you have questions that are starting to come to mind, please feel free to add those as well, and we'll keep an eye on them and discuss them later on in the presentation. So with that, Sitali, are you ready to take us in the next conversation?
I am ready, and thank you so much, Marisa and Nelson. And welcome to everyone, and thank you as well to all of you for joining this webinar. We're so glad that in a number of locations we have both partners and we have both governments and partners joining together. This is really important because we think that we could use the space we have today to also discuss some very practical ways of how this could be taken forward. So I will build on the background that Nelson has given us. For those of you that have been with SWA for a long time, you will obviously remember the commitments which were made in the past. Most of them made by governments, and in the last cycle we had about 45 governments that made commitments, and we had 12 donors make commitments. In addition to those, we had the 2 civil society organizations that had made commitments, but that was a bit of an anomaly. So even in the reporting, those commitments from the 2 civil society organizations were not included. As Nelson has said, the new paradigm now is to move towards a really mutual system for accountability, one that does not only focus on one set of partners or only on a few types of partners. So this system is indeed broad in its reach, in that it encompasses all partners. And then it also builds on the national process, because that is where the rubber hits the road, as people say. That's where the action is, and that's where most of the changes would actually happen. So how would this look like in practice? In practice, we suggest, and this has been developed through work with a number of partners, that SWA partners operating at the country level, working with the government or under the leadership of the government, could come together and in their conversations around the national plan These are national plans that would have a 3 or 5 year cycle, depending on the cycle that you have at country level. That these plans would have targets and milestones. So usually these plans, we anticipate that they already have targets and milestones that cover a 3 to 5 year horizon. Out of that, or rather guided by that plan, the government would highlight 2 to 3 country level commitments. These are really sort of the priorities that they would like to have emphasis on. And obviously that process of selecting those 2 to 3 commitments could also be done in a consultative manner, in a joint fashion with other partners. But we do highlight the fact that government is in the lead of doing that process because of collaborative behavior number 1, which is about government leadership. Once the government working with the partners have highlighted these 2 to 3 country level commitments which are aimed at achieving those targets or milestones or priorities that are in the plan, then that they could also outline together with partners a timeline for achieving those commitments. This timeline in the previous cycle was often a 2-year cycle, from one HLM to the next HLM, which is what made those commitments very much centered on the HLMs. In this new cycle, we're saying that that timeline has to fit the context. It doesn't have to fit the 2-year cycle that we had for the HLMs. It could fit a timeline that matches with the priorities in the plan. But after those commitments have been selected, there has to be a deliberate way to have a timeline of when they would be achieved. In actual sense, this would be in effect to try and make the commitments smart, to make them specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. Once that process has been done, we suggest that various groups of partners of SWA that in the current SWA system are called constituencies, and there are 5 of these. There is the private sector constituency, there is the civil society constituency, there is the external support agency constituencies, and this is the group that includes development banks. It includes UN agencies such as UNICEF, the World Bank, as well as other regional bodies such as for Africa, such as the African Ministers Council. So those types of organizations are part of what is called the external support agencies. And in addition to that, we've got the research and learning constituency, and then the government is more or less the bigger constituency that we also have. Now, the suggestion is that after the commitments have been jointly selected, there's a timeline. These commitments are smart in their preparation. Then each specific group of constituencies or partners could sit together and identify how they will contribute towards achieving those commitments. We will show an example on that very shortly. So it could be that as a group of civil society organizations, they come together and say, to achieve these commitments that have been jointly agreed, we think our collective contribution could be in the area of research, in the area of obtaining the citizen voice, in the area of increasing participation or accountability, or any other way of actually making those commitments happen. This could be done by group, by constituency. It could also be done by an individual partner. So, for example, the World Bank in a specific country could look at their own country strategy and determine what contributions they have which are aligned to their country strategy, which also align to this commitment. In some cycles, it might be that the commitments which are jointly agreed could also influence the country strategy of such institutions when they have to revise it at the next cycle, when they have to revise it. So in a way, it is a chicken and egg situation, that these commitments could align with already existing country strategies from development partners in terms of how they're supporting the country, but these commitments or priorities could also influence the future cycle of strategies that partners are doing. The interest in doing this, or rather the rationale, is that there should be an increase in alignment between government priorities, which is a national ownership issue, as well as the support that other partners are giving, which is a key development effectiveness principle. After this process has been done, these the partners that have got a presence at the country level but also have got a global reach could also make commitments at the global level. So I'll give an example of a partner such as the World Bank, since it's the one I had mentioned earlier. In various countries where they operate, we would expect that they engage with the process, make the commitments through the constituency they have or individually, but then at the global level, such institutions could also make commitments as they used to do in the past, and these could be commitments that are multinational in nature or that are even focused at strengthening regional support towards the achievement of these commitments. So that is also another possibility that can happen with this updated accountability mechanism, and it is an aspect that partly retains what we had in the past, where the global partners made commitments at the global level, but now we're encouraging them at the in the country process to be much more involved and to be clear in terms of what contribution they're putting to the table, so that each partner can bring in their resources and weight to the table. In terms of practical flow of events, in terms of how we think this would work, we think that there are a number of stages that happen, there are a number of processes that happen at country level. And these happen, we've put them in a linear way, but this does not necessarily should not necessarily always be in this linear format. I think it could be best if it happens this way, but sometimes it might be different. So we think that part of the beginning or the starting point is when the country is assessing or analyzing how the sector is set up, what the challenges are in the sector, what the bottlenecks are, and what the gaps are in the sector. So in this phase of assessment and analysis, there are various tools that are used to understand the challenges that are in the sector. This is more or less sector diagnostic tools. Some of these tools are the Washbat by UNICEF. The GLASS country highlights also contribute to that. The collaborative behaviors country profiles also contribute to that. So if these are the material which help provide the evidence of what the gaps are in the sector, we take that as the starting point to identify where the challenges and gaps are. The next would be to plan and set the targets. So for example, if on one of the collaborative behavior, let's maybe say the collaborative behavior on having an information system for which supports mutual accountability, if that is not in place, partners looking through their collaborative country behavior profile could set as their vision or as their target to set up one platform for strengthening sector reviews and sector planning. That timeline could be a 2-year timeline. That could be a commitment that that country has. Then various partners or constituencies could then articulate what their contribution would be to that. So we see this sort of coming from that process of assessing or analyzing the gap in the sector, and then doing the planning and setting the targets, and defining the roles and responsibilities of the various actors, which is also the one of the steps in making the commitments. Then there's the process of implementation, which happens through the partner actions, and the monitoring and evaluation, as well as assessment of the progress on that on those commitments, is one that we think happens again through this multi-stakeholder conversation that happens at country level. And it also happens that when countries are able to report on their progress through maybe their sector coordination meetings or their sector reviews, that they report on these commitments at country level. So this is a process that's really embedded in that national process from the time of doing the assessment to the time of monitoring and evaluation and getting back to the assessment as well. Now, how would this link to SWA? We think that when in the planning and target setting process at country level, at that point, commitments could already begin to emerge at the country level. Those commitments, when they are developed, they could be shared with SWA. It doesn't have to wait for the HLM. They could be shared at whatever stage, and then we would keep them in the database that SWA would be running. And then when the reporting also happens at country level, that report, which shows the progress at country level, could also be shared with SWA. There would inevitably be areas of challenges and gaps, and it is these areas where we think the power of the partnership can come in to strengthen the learning, to bring ministers together and tackle those areas where there are challenges. It could be in financing, as we had in the past. It could be in, say, the building block of planning or target setting for the SDGs. So that can help and bring the power of the partnership into strengthening learning on that aspect. Here's just one example of how we envisage this could work, that at the national level, that commitment selected by the government in that process with partners could be, say, a commitment that focuses on developing a rural sanitation strategy which targets the poorest districts by year X, say 2022. That the country wants to have a rural sanitation strategy which targets the poorest districts. We think that the external support agencies, that group of actors, could, for example, come up with a commitment which is about aligning their resources and funding to the priorities of the strategy and to target their financing to those poorest communities, which is to make sure that the financing actually goes to areas that need it the most. Civil society could also come up with a commitment which is about identifying approaches that will improve sanitation in those poorest communities and the hardest to reach areas. Research and learning institutions can also come up with a commitment which is more about researching into other experiences from other countries, and then private sector could have a commitment as well that supports that overall commitment agreed by all the actors. So we put this just as a hypothetical to show that there's the broadest commitment could then be supported by individual contributions from various constituencies. The review process, as I had said earlier on, is embedded again in the country process. When the country does the review, they also share those results with us. So partners would review commitments as part of their national multi-stakeholder process, as and when they have agreed to do that. But in some of the earlier conversations we've had, it's sort of a known fact that in some cases there are no review mechanisms. So maybe a commitment could be that country X wants to put in place systematic mechanisms to review progress for the SDGs, and that those mechanisms then include the commitments. All stakeholders comment on that process because we would like that to actually continue to maintain the multi-stakeholder nature. And then national and regional monitoring processes and mechanisms such as JMP, GLASS, and collaborative behaviors country profiles can continue to feed into those processes in terms of providing information, in terms of providing the analytical input for that review. And this is also areas where support could be solicited from other parts of the partnership. Now, how will the mutual accountability mechanism be reported on? In the past, after the HLM, when the commitments were made at the HLM, 1 year after those commitments were made, we would send to each country an Excel sheet and say, you report on your progress. Now, as you have noticed, we're saying that reporting should start with the country process, but we would like to harvest out of that country process the progress that you're making and put this progress on the same database that we would be maintaining. So we would not be using this very strong sort of follow-up mechanism we had in the past, which was we send an Excel document, send us reports within the next 2 to 3 weeks. We would always be reminding countries, once you do the review and reporting, please share with us. However, if there's no report on those commitments, it would begin to show in subsequent years that yes, we have commitments, but it seems as though there's been no reporting because then our database doesn't show that progress. So we would maintain an online portal where country commitments and progress towards those commitments is updated as and when national reviews happen. And all partners will also have the opportunity to comment on the achievements that are being made. And then every 3 years, we intend to prepare a global mutual accountability report, which would provide an overview of what commitments have been received, maybe delve into one aspect of the nature of those commitments, and provide some analytical aspects on those commitments. At the global level, countries can present commitments. So the next sector ministers meeting is being planned for next year, sometime in the second quarter or so. At that time, countries that will be ready with commitments could share those commitments. We want as many countries as possible to be ready, but given that this is a system that follows the national process, it may be possible that in some countries the commitments are not yet ready. However, we are really encouraging and hoping that at that point there would be commitments that are available, and those commitments should not only be prepared because of the sector ministers meeting, but they should emerge out of the national conversation. So commitments can be presented there. External support agencies also make the global commitments, and all partners report back on previously made commitments, and then there's room to have a discussion on the progress that's being made and to learn from each other. There are also links with the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. This is the forum that the broader UN is using to follow up and track progress on the SDGs. The High-Level Political Forum for 2018 ended a few weeks ago, and this year it included SDG 6 on water and sanitation. There was a 3-hour session which was used to discuss progress in SDG 6, and there were also comments that came through that 3-hour session is not sufficient to discuss all progress, but the preparation towards the High-Level Political Forum is helpful because a number of countries do voluntary national reviews in which they look at how far they're progressing on various SDGs. So we think that this process of commitments can help countries that are intending to do voluntary national reviews to be ready and to be able to engage effectively in that process. But we think that in terms of the content and discussion and having a real strategic conversation on where we're going, this could be achieved through the sector ministers meeting or through other regional platforms as well. Next steps at the global level, this is mostly at the Secretariat, working with other partners that are supporting this process. We are preparing communications materials. Some of these have been sent around, but there are more materials that we're preparing which will come through, including a video, and as a result of these webinars, we'll also prepare a frequently asked questions brochure. We will also be ready to do individual country calls, so we encourage you to sit down as a country and see the process that you have in your country, and then let us have a conversation with you when you feel that the time is ripe for us to engage, and we're happy for this to start as soon as in the next month or so. And then commitments gathering, sort of us picking on the commitments that are now emerging out of country processes. This can start as early as September, and we already know of countries such as Ethiopia, which just had their multi-stakeholder forum that came up with undertakings or commitments, so to say. We could already pick from there, or once that country is ready to share with us, then we can receive those and already begin to share. So, and then calls with constituencies. These are specific calls that we will organize, for example, between the Secretariat and the external support agencies at the global level, so that they too could mobilize their partners, their colleagues operating at various levels to engage effectively with this system. We're really keen to look at lessons on the process and results, and these lessons would be gathered and documented so that maybe by the time of the sector ministers meeting next year, we're able to have some highlights of lessons that are being learned, but also some results that are emerging out of this process. At country level, this is really crucial. We would like to suggest that you meet, those of you operating at country level, you meet with your other colleagues and have a discussion to look back at this presentation and see what your possible next steps could be. You might want to outline a roadmap for your country, detailing when the opportunities exist for that national process. Could be maybe you have a JSR coming up in the next few months, or it could be that maybe you want to use this process to actually gather partners together and create the momentum. So that is up to you. We also think that the step at an additional step at country level is then the development of the commitments through those multi-stakeholder processes. And once that is done, you share those commitments with us, and then those commitments can also be shared at the global level, the regional global level, once those opportunities emerge. For the future, this is an idea of this is the cycle of meetings that the steering committee agreed in March this year. So the steering committee agreed that the finance ministers meetings, which happen in Washington, D.C., at the time of the World Bank and IMF spring meetings, this is usually in April, that these will happen every 3 years. So you could already begin to think through how you could use these meetings for your own national processes. So the next finance ministers meeting would be in 2020, and then one meeting every 3 years thereafter. Sector ministers have a different rhythm. So we would like to maintain the system that the kind of meeting that we had in 2016, where ministers met in a country setup that's dealing with the challenges that we're talking about. And here the last meeting in 2016 was in Ethiopia. So we would like to maintain the system of moving from country to country in a 3-year cycle as well. So the next meeting would then be in 2019, and then the next after that would be 2021, 2024, 2027, and 2030 in a country setup. However, every time finance ministers meet, they also want to have sector ministers there. And this is then the opportunistic sector ministers meeting that happens in Washington, D.C. And if now you look at this cycle, you'll see that sector ministers meeting would be expected to meet every 18 months. But then the big ones for them will be every 3 years. So this is the presentation we wanted to share with you, but we are really keen to hear from you if you have any questions, but whether there are opportunities you already see in your country in terms of how you could link this mechanism with an ongoing process. And then we have a few sort of discussion questions that we wanted to use. But for now, I think it'll be good for us to see if you have any questions, and therefore I will give it back to Marisa to moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Sitali, for that. There's a lot of detail there. So now is a great time to talk it through. So I again encourage anyone that has a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. If there's a reflection on either comments that Nelson or Sitali made that you'd like to discuss, I'd encourage you to either open your line and feel free to ask it, or to put it in the chat. We've got time to do that now.
So Marisa, I see Dara is typing. We could open his mic. We could unmute his microphone, and then he could speak. I think that. Dara, if you wanted to speak, you could go ahead. Your microphone is unmuted now.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that in Bangladesh we're undertaking a national washbat exercise. We've done 2 divisions already and have 5 more to go. So when we get to that point, we'll be very much in a position to discuss with government how we can move forward with this kind of mechanism. I think that they will be much more comfortable when they have this kind of nationwide exercise, when they're able to see where they stand. And it would also fit nicely into their own planning cycle, which ends in 2020. They have a 5-year plan, and that will be completed in 2020. So the opportunity is coming for them to kind of fit this into their national benchmarks and their national challenges.
Great, thank you so much. That's a really I think that it looks like the blocks are falling in place very well. That there is sort of a sector diagnosis that's happening with the washbat, and then that creates momentum, or rather, it provides the backbone for this to happen. So I think that would be good, and would be very happy to engage also with the process as and when you and with the government colleagues feel that it's more effective to do that. Thank you.
I noticed that Dr. Kuang may be typing as well. Dr. Kuang, can we open up your line? Dr. Kuang? I see that he's written into the chat, and thanks for the presentation. Oh, Satali, if we could try and open Dr. Kuang's line, maybe?
It is unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Kuang, please go ahead if you can. Okay, then maybe we'll wait and come back to him. I see that he's typing. We have a colleague in Mongolia who's noted they haven't done the comprehensive national washbat analysis, but are planning to conduct one in between September and October as a starting point. So that's great to hear as well. Thank you for sharing that.
Great, and Kim, your line is also unmuted in case you or the government colleagues wanted to also speak to the opportunities that are coming up. And this is exactly the kind of conversation we're hoping to have, to just sort of look through the next 6 months or so and see what opportunities exist to embed this process. And in some cases, it might be that maybe there's no sector analysis that is planned, and maybe that's one of the issues that the group of partners might want to start with, but it doesn't always have to start with that. In some countries, maybe there was an analysis done last year or at the beginning of this year that could also still be relevant as a starting point. But thank you so much, and your line is also unmuted, Kim, if you wanted to pick it up.
Okay. Kim, if you'd like to chat, please chime in. I think Cecilia might go back to Dr. Kuan's comment. He suggested that the mutual accountability mechanism requires a very strong leading agency, likely the government, and needs strong leadership at the national level in order to work together with stakeholders.
Yes, and happy to hear the views of other partners as well. I just remember in the webinar we had earlier on, other government colleagues were also able to provide insights on a question like this. You're very right, Dr. Kuong. This would require leadership, and that is why collaborative behavior number one of SWA is government leadership and ownership of the process, and that is what mobilizes partners. That's what helps to bring the right data to the conversation and to have the right agenda being discussed. So what are we doing to hopefully address that part? We've worked through, we realized that I think the one of the big pieces of this process is the role of the focal points in finding that leadership and motivating that leadership into playing this role. So we started earlier in the year to try and clean up the list of focal points that we had. In some countries we had the 2 focal points that we needed from government. In some places we had maybe only one, and so we developed some terms of reference, and we shared these terms of reference with governments and requested that they update us on who is their focal points. And one of the actions that we have on the slide here at the country level is that it might be good for focal points to come together at country level and start the conversation. Now, I mentioned that I mentioned 2 focal points for government, but the entire system that we're working through is to have actually 2 focal points for government, and then have a focal point for civil society, a focal point for external support agencies, and then where possible research and learning, as well as private sector. We think that this group of focal points can help to internalize this information, then motivate others, and find the national opportunities where they could engage with the process. So I fully agree with you on this, on the point that it requires a strong leadership and strong partnership. And we're really keen on Vietnam as well to pick up this conversation later, to see how we could perhaps, if it would be helpful, how we could contribute to that. Thank you.
Great. Did someone want to chime in there?
Yeah. Can Timor-Leste say something?
Sure, please, go ahead.
Hi, Inês here. Thank you for the presentation. So I'm here, I'm an advisor to the Government Ministry of Public Works and the Water and Sanitation Director General. Unfortunately, my Timorese colleagues were not able to be here now, so I can't, whatever I say, it's not a commitment or any of that, because I need to share the presentation with them as well. But just for your own knowledge of the forum, Timor-Leste had recently elections, so a new government has been set a month ago, and we're now going through a process of planning the next 5 years. So I guess this is the right time and the right momentum for us to consider the national targets and then work together with our development partners to assist them as well in their commitments. So I think we'll try to embrace as much as we can our collaborative work with our partners and set up our commitments. And we'll keep you in touch and then see whenever we're ready, maybe in September or October, maybe we can have this individual country call and discuss it a bit further with you. Adding to that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. That's really good news, and we're so happy to pick up the conversation. So if you're going back to give them an update, and whenever them and yourselves are ready, could be in September, we would be very happy to pick up the conversation and discuss. Also, one thing to note is that we could be able to actually organize that conversation to happen in Portuguese, if that is what would help to actually for other government colleagues as well. But we're keen to pick it up as soon as possible. Thank you.
And I just have, thank you, and I just have 2 questions on the presentation, not as much on the accountability side of things, but on some of the meetings. You mentioned the HLPF, the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Do you know how does it work, and if Timor-Leste is involved or not? Because now I'm not sure how the new government, is it being part, and do they know about this, or is there something that we should be doing to acknowledge our leaders about this forum? And the other one is regarding the sector ministerial meetings. So you've said 2019, 21, 24, 27, and 30. My question is, do you already have all countries selected for those meetings, or how does it normally do in terms of invitations? Imagine that I can put on the table, we can put on the table, maybe if Timor-Leste would be interested in hosting one, what would that mean? So what are things there? How long before would we need to do it? What's the commitment? So I would like to get a bit more understanding about those 2 meetings, if possible.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. That's could we just go back to the slide on the cycle of meetings? I think it's Nelson who has the. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So for this cycle of meetings, the countries have not yet been determined, and it's a very timely question you ask, because this week, in fact, there was a discussion about the 2019 meeting in terms of where it could take place. So the countries have not yet been determined, and if a country was interested to host, I think that would be a welcome idea for that country to indicate, to express the interest that they were interested to host one of these meetings. I think that would be an interesting thing if that was a possibility. I think we will know at some point this year where exactly the meeting for next year will happen. There are a few ideas that are being discussed, perhaps it being linked to the Latino Sun, which will happen in Costa Rica in April. So that's just one of the possibilities. It's not yet cast in stone. Then for the question about the HLPF, the high-level political forum, the leadership for that is done through UNDESA, which sits within UNDP, and what they do is that countries that want to do the voluntary national review express interest. So for the previous cycle, the 2018 high-level political forum, which just ended, they already had a list of countries that had expressed interest as of the previous year. And they had 48 countries, and out of those 48, 15 were SWA partner countries. And how those countries expressed interest, it was mostly through their Foreign Affairs Ministry or through their Ministry of Planning or Economic Development. And SWA does not get very much involved, but once they have the list, we go through the list and we see which SWA partners have indicated an interest to do a voluntary national review. And what we did this year was that we organized then a special webinar for those countries, so then they could be much more prepared as they go to the high-level political forum. And so I think for Timor-Leste it might be interesting we could put you in touch actually with the UNDP colleagues, with the UNDESA colleagues, so then they could give an indication as to whether Timor-Leste is on the list for next year or is not on the list at all. I think that would be the best starting point, because they would know if there's been an expression of interest either from the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. That would be great. Rodolfo, Marisa has our email addresses, but I can then later on this afternoon send her again our email addresses, and then you can send to us for the contact of UNDP. Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you. We've had 2 additional comments, and so I just invite those 2 individuals to take the mic if they would like to. One of our colleagues in Pakistan was referring to their joint reviews, and then Therese made several very interesting points in her chat as well. And so I'll just ask again before reading them. Would either of you like to take the mic and just and share with us your comments?
I'm sure I can pop in just to save people reading maybe. Just 3 quick things from South Asia. I mean, I think number 1 is I'm not seeing in your proposed cycle or in even in the discussion linkages to the regional processes, and for South Asia it's quite important because we do have a very strong South Asia sort of cycle of conferences on sanitation with the follow-ups and ministerial groups. So I think it'd be really good to see how they fit into to the processes. And as you're aware, this year the declaration and the agreed action points by the sector ministers from throughout the region, it changed from the tradition, and we sort of introduced more strongly the building blocks, so that we would be sort of all aligning sort of together under the same language and the same proposals. I think secondly, we've got a lot of coordination mechanisms and mechanisms going on. I mean, Theo commented separately at the same time about the JSRs in Pakistan, but we do have one washers, and we've lots of different coordination mechanisms in different countries. And I think what we really need to stress when we're discussing this is that we're building on the existing. We're not creating something new. So the name of it doesn't really matter. It's just that we're all utilizing the same processes, if you like, and we're all trying to reach the same end goal. And then finally, I think most people on the call will know that the government of India is hosting the Mahatma Gandhi International Sanitation Conference from the 28th of September to the 2nd of October. And they have invited, I think at the moment it's close to 100 sector ministers from around the world. And there are going to be ministerial dialogues and ministerial sessions. This is hosted by the government of India, and just with some support. But I think, you know, this may have an impact on your cycle, because if a lot of the ministers come to India in October, will they be up for another meeting early next year? So just to flag that. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Therese. And I also check if Nelson, if you wanted to pick any of these questions to also respond, that we could. We also have Virginia on the call, who was very key in the development of the Mutual Accountability Mechanism. So Virginia, in case you wanted, also please feel free. So just before I come to the points you've raised, Therese, just to note the point by Theodros, which is a really sort of very good indication of what has happened in Pakistan with the provincial JSRs, and then the potential of the national one coming up. I think that is a very good build towards what would fit very well with this mutual accountability mechanism. And we recall that Pakistan has more or less indicated. So what we presented today also benefited a lot from a number of countries, and one of those case studies was done in Pakistan. And I think the idea of the homegrown commitments, as we're referred to in Pakistan, is one that fits the context and also fits what is being discussed here. So just be very keen to see what emerges out of that national process, Theodros. And then I think the other thing that we're keen to see is the extent to which the various partners or constituencies actually pull their weight to the table, and not just make it look like it's just the government that's committing, but also that they actually joined in a way. So we'll be keen to see how that comes through. Now, Therese, you bring up very important points. One is the link with SACOSAN, which we fully agree with you, and it was really good that already SACOSAN, the declaration from there, focused on the was structured around the building blocks. The commitments made at that regional platform for countries within the South Asia region, they could very much use those commitments. So what we're trying to avoid is for countries to make commitments just for the sake of SWA. If there are commitments they've made at national level or at the regional level, those commitments could be the same. They do not need to change the commitments. I think what we're keenly looking into is the extent to which also the other partners bring their weight into that mechanism. And we already highlighted, if I didn't present it here, then maybe it was an oversight, but that we're really keen to also use regional platforms in terms of the tracking or the follow-up So it might be that at a regional platform, at the regional meeting, that provides the best opportunity to actually discuss the progress that's being made. But that's in line with those commitments at the regional level. And then the SWA MOLE sort of secretariat and other partners could just reinforce that mechanism that already exists. So I hope that helps. And then on the India meeting, indeed that has been, we're aware of that, and it's being discussed in the context of what happens in 2019. At the moment, I think that's the best we could say, that the context of what happens in 2019 is also being discussed in view of other activities more general in the sector, in terms of trying to make the best of the opportunities that exist, and what would make most sense to ministers both of water and sanitation, because as we understand, it's possible that the India meeting would mostly focus on sanitation. So perhaps then it could be that the focus is slightly different. But let me say that I think at an opportune time, not far from now, this will be more or less sort of clear and with a clear path forward. Thank you.
Nelson or Virginia, would you like to make any comments now?
Yes, Marisa, so maybe I can start, and it's quite great to hear especially the feedback from colleagues in the countries, but also what we have just heard from Teresa here. I think it offers quite interesting perspectives. Now, first of all, I think for us it's interesting to note that there are quite a number of different multi-stakeholder processes going on. Of course, we have heard about the wash baths, we have heard about plans for the joint sector reviews in different countries, and these I think offer quite a good ground for linkages with the processes that we are looking at here. I think we have good news, or we are hearing some good developments in Mongolia, Timor-Leste, and as well as Nepal and other countries, at least on the call today, which is great. And then I think there was a point which I heard earlier on, which I felt is quite critical, and I believe that maybe colleagues on the call would better provide guidance on how to deal with this. I think there was a point to say, if we really are to achieve what we want with the mutual accountability mechanism, then definitely we need to look into ensuring that there is strong leadership, especially from the government, and maybe supporting the government, and also making sure that we have this leadership a little bit more strong and playing the role at the national level, especially when it comes to some of these processes that we have mentioned. And I believe that I think colleagues on the call today would definitely provide a lot of maybe insights on how to go about this. Yes, we are aware that we have been looking at how to maybe strengthen the roles of the focal persons in different constituencies of the partnership, but I think those of us on the call would definitely help guide and offer insights on how to make sure that we are successful in that. And then reflecting on what Teresa has said, I think the emphasis on linkages with regional levels is quite great, and I think the South Asia provides some huge examples, at least from the presentation from Trace, because there was a deliberate, I think, emphasis in the South Asia declaration to link the declaration at the ministerial level to the building blocks, and I think this makes it pretty easier to even bring these and to share some of these at the global level. And we hope that maybe adopting this particular approach, other regions would maybe follow suit as well. We know there are plans for the Latino Sun, we know there are plans for Africa Sun, as well as the Africa Water Week, which are processes at the regional level. And I think the desire is that these processes as well at the regional level should be responding maybe to the needs and ongoing or existing processes at the country level as well, so that they offer that particular opportunity for easy linkages with all the other global processes that we are talking about here. So this is something that I think we can explore further and look at how the organizations that are leading plans for Latino Sun, Africa Sun, as well as Africa Water Week at the regional level are able to address this. Of course, we also know that in the East Asia region, there could be a couple of other regional processes as well. So these are good reflections, really, and perspectives that we need to take into consideration. But more and more, I think I recognize the need for stronger champions, stronger leadership at the country level, especially to take much advantage from the ongoing processes, national planning or review processes. That is. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. I just want to acknowledge that we are beyond the 1 hour mark, and so we certainly have time to continue the conversation. We have some comments in the chat that I'll get to in just a moment, but just to say, if people do need to leave, we certainly do understand that, and just to share that the recording of the webinar will be posted on the SWA website, as well as materials about the Mutual Accountability Mechanism. In just a moment, I'll add a link in the chat to that webpage if useful. And you can also contact us as well if you have any difficulty with accessing documents on that webpage and would prefer to have us send them directly. So let me just note our colleague Dinesh in Nepal was mentioning that they will be going through a joint sector review at the end of September, and I see that Sitali has already suggested that the Secretariat can be helpful, that we'd like to do that. And I'd like to now go to the comment from Partha in Bangladesh, and the comment was about how the accountability mechanism is not universal, and it needs some contextualization for specific countries, and how would we describe it? Sitali, I see that you just noted a comment, but I wonder if you could just take it a step further.
Yes, indeed. So, Partha, thank you so much for that. Like we were saying in the previous cycle, that the mechanism we had in the past, which was centered so much at ministers come to Washington, make commitments, go back, that was one that was very global in a way, centered on those meetings. And now this mechanism is anchored much more in those national processes. And that is why we're saying to our colleagues in country sort of leadership and others that are supporting the governments to actually identify those opportunities at country level where they could strengthen the mutual accountability. And what I think we've presented are more or less the broad strokes of the principle, but then how it is applied, when it is applied, what mechanism works the best at country level is obviously left up to the country in the context. I think what is really important is that whatever, say, commitments that emerge out of this process, that they should be ambitious, they should be realistic but ambitious as well, and that they should not just be the lowest common denominator, but that they should actually be the kinds of commitments that would lead to the change that is needed for the SDGs to be achieved. And so that cannot be defined at the global level. I think that can be defined at the country level. What priorities, what targets countries want to set for themselves, that's definitely sort of a country context. There's a paper which was done recently by a number of partners, also with the support of SWA, on accountability mechanism. And just to say that what we're saying here is not in it is in tandem with what is in that paper as well, and we could share that in case it would be needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Satali. Are there more questions? Any other comments that people would like to make? We have the opportunity to address them now, so it's a great time to do that. That said, we're also not forcing questions or comments. So if we've come to sort of a natural conclusion, I'd like to ask Nelson and Satali if they have any closing remarks that they might like to make. Satali, do you have any closing comments?
I was just going to say thank you so much to everyone, and Dinesh, because there was just one point that remained here. I think we could pick up the conversation soon, maybe by phone, because what we could do, which we did for a few countries that were having their JSRs, is to provide a tailored presentation that then could be made. But I think the beauty of the opportunity you're having in September is that already at the end of that process, commitments or undertakings, as they call them in Ethiopia, or homegrown commitments, can already emerge out of that process, and then which means that some of the early commitments that we could be sharing before the end of the year could already be coming out of a process like that. So that's why we're keen to speak with you, and I think in that context, see how the planning is going for the JSR, but obviously how and when you would like this to be brought into that conversation, and if there will be any materials you need from us, we can prepare them ahead of time. We've got the collaborative behavior country profiles for Nepal. Yes, I think we actually did give them to Mr. Anil. But if there are any other materials that were needed, for example, we could also have those ready and sent to you. So that's why I'm thinking we could speak at some point soon. Thank you so much, and to you and to everyone else who joined today.
Thank you, Satali. Nelson, any closing remarks?
Well, not much really to say at this stage, Marisa, but just to appreciate especially the comments from the colleagues, because I think these are very variable in the sense that as we look at the rolling out the mutual accountability mechanism, I think we need to understand how colleagues, especially on the core, view this, and how can we achieve the linkages basically with the existing processes. And I think that's quite critical, really. And if there may be any other reflections that might come after we have closed the call, it could be great really to get some feedback either in a written form so that we can have maybe a more in-depth discussion and insights. I think we would definitely count on the colleagues' experiences that obtains at the country level, but also we have heard about the regional level here. So that could be quite great for us, especially as we also try to maybe communicate to other partners within the partnership. Of course, we are doing this webinar focusing on maybe colleagues at country and maybe regional level, but then we have other constituencies, especially the external support agencies, the private sector, the civil society. It's a question of how do we ensure that we are on the same page, and then we are generating the same understanding across the stakeholders in different spaces as well. I think that would be quite critical. But at the same time, also, we believe that those on the call, at least with this information, could be able to explain to other partners that might not have been able to probably be part of this series of webinars on the mutual accountability. But otherwise, thank you so much for the questions and for the comments, and I will definitely take these away and ensure that we look at them a little further and try to explain where necessary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nelson. And I will just reiterate both Sotali and Nelson's gratitude and echo that we're here if you have questions or would like to have more in-depth conversations. More than happy to do that. You'll see in the chat I added the link to the webpage for the Mutual Accountability Mechanism. And just to say again that we will be posting the recording for this webinar in the next several days, and we'll likely send out a recap of the discussion as well as some other materials. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it and hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.